Hey everyone, welcome back to the Global Medical Device Podcast. My name is Etienne Nichols, and today we're going to be talking about software as a medical device, but specifically about production controls. Because software is changing everything in medtech, and the rules that we've relied on for decades, they weren't necessarily built with apps in mind that update weekly or cloud-based devices that evolve in real time. So today we're going to dig into the production side of ISO 1345 or for software as a medical device, where the gray area lives. Hopefully, that's always my favorite place to play, where teams stumble and how to actually stay compliant without killing that innovation. If you've ever wondered what really happens behind the scenes, hopefully this episode is for you. And today to talk about this is Adnan Ashfaq, founder of Simplimedica. He spent over 25 years in quality, and I always get the years mixed up, so you're going to have to correct me, but he's spent working on regulatory validation work across startups, global medtech companies. He's been in the trenches implementing ISO 1345, writing C technical files, validating software as a medical device under IEC 62304, and remediating FDA design history files. Basically, if there's a gray area in medtech compliance, he's seen it, he's lived it, he's worked it. So today he's here to share what really works, what usually trips people up, and how to navigate the tricky world of software in medical devices. But I could pontificate about a lot of different things, but good to have you to get today with us, Adnan. How are you doing?
No, fantastic. Yeah. Once again, thanks very much, Etienne, for having me on the podcast. It's always a complete pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, I always appreciate you willing to share your experience and your expertise, really. So, I mean, I don't know where you want to begin necessarily. If you want to just dive in, maybe we want to talk a little bit of ISO 1345 and the typical approach or the
Yeah.
expectation, and then we can kind of navigate or kind of move over into what that means for software.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, usually, the time and space that we have is never enough to talk about the
Yeah.
subject because I can really go into the weeds of things with this. So, I mean, if you look at historically, I mean, ISO 13485 hasn't actually been around for very long. If
Yeah.
we actually think about regulations, really, even in Europe, the medical device development and the amendments came through from the FDA originally, and then in 1993 we developed in Europe the medical device directives, and then 2017. Since then, we've had the much debated medical device regulations. And over the course of that time, we've had ISO 9001, which was aligned, or 13485, which was aligned with ISO 9001 from 2003. And then we've had the revision in 2016. And then more recently, we've been told that ISO 13485 will not be revised in 2026, which is a typical period of after 10 years. An ISO standard would get reviewed for revision. So having said that, I think it's quite timely to have a look at and look at the application of ISO 13485 with medical device software in mind. And the reason why I'm particularly interested in that, as you know, ITN, from my background, I come from a manufacturing background, with physical medical devices. That's where I started off. And in the last 10 years, I've been delving a lot more into medical device software. And then as an engineer, we tend to look at things very technically and how can you apply something from one set of standards to another, where typically the ISO 13485 doesn't distinguish between hardware and software, right?
Yeah.
So my starting point really in this conversation is to cherry pick some of those clauses from ISO 13485, which are more akin to production. And then how do we then unpack that and apply it with medical device software in mind? That's where I'm going with this podcast and discussion.
Yeah. Okay, great. I love it. And yeah, it is interesting because like you said, it doesn't distinguish between software and mechanical or hardware. But there's nearly always some kind of I don't know, analogy you can take. And I'm just thinking from my mechanical engineering background, how if you wanted to learn electrical science, you apply the easy to understand plumbing technology. You said water flows this way, same thing with voltage and so on. So but
Yeah.
it's a similar situation, I think. And so hopefully we can come up with some illustrations that make sense to the audience. But let's talk about the clauses that you want to jump into. Where do you want to start there?
Yeah, so I'm going to start. I'm kind of going to move straight into clause 7.5, but then I'm also going to come back to the other clause as well because Clause 7.5 is really where it starts to get a bit kind of muddy for many startups, specifically not just startups, but even those that are developing medical device software. How do you apply Clause 7.5 production and service provision, where we're looking at the core clauses for production framework, and then you're looking at the process validation, for example, clause 7.5.6,
Yeah.
traceability 7.5.9, customer property 7.5.10, and then 7.5.11, preservation of property, production preservation. So then when we're looking at those clauses, we do have to apply them there. So some companies try to think that they're non-applicable clauses, so they may be not applicable because we don't have hardware. But the fact and the reality is, let's look at this and unpack this a little bit, because when we start to have a look at the production framework, we have to apply those clauses, building the processes and looking at integration, looking at comprehensive test protocols. What we have to do, so thinking of it almost like a pipeline that we've got virtually when we think about um, a production environment, you think a factory with physical machines, a
Hmm.
physical space, an infrastructure, and those processes that you might think that's going to be manufacturing physical hardware. Now, when we look at those clauses, we have to have a look at clause 7.5, and we have to look at it in a virtual space. So, what does that mean? You almost have to think of this as a virtual manufacturing space. And if we think about when you're building software, and real examples of that, you have to think about the controlled environment that you're going to actually produce the software. So that's where you get into the terminology from EN 62304. You look at the software item, the software system, and the software unit, right? So you start off with the software um, item, and then you go down to the software system and then the software unit, which the software unit is the lowest denominator, the lowest component. Um,
Lines of code, maybe.
the code, but then you have to have a look at, for example, let's take GitHub or GitLab or some of the software environments where you are developing. There may be open source software where you're actually using to develop the software that you're designing, and then you're going to use then building blocks, and you'll then bring in different software. This is where we get into soup. So the software of unknown provenance. You start bringing those building blocks in, and as also then it starts getting interesting because those building blocks that you're bringing in also have to be validated as well. So you've got the environment, which if the space that you're producing the medical device software in, which it could be the open source software, and then you're starting to use those building blocks. You've got to think of that almost as a production framework. And we also have to think of this in terms of the soup items, those software of unknown provenance, which are then being brought in as your supplier verification. So also we're looking at supplier evaluation here, and you're applying clause 7.4 purchasing processes, and you're applying that to the software of unknown provenance, because really what you're doing is you're purchasing some of those building blocks, quote unquote, from off-the-shelf items, but you've not got any validation. You need to make sure that there's quality assurance built in to those building blocks before you start to actually design and code your own software within that space. So you're almost thinking of this in virtual terms, where you had that production framework and you're thinking about how do you verify those soup items. So there's a verification, and this is where clause 7.4 comes in with the purchasing process, where you've got to then look at the verification of those building blocks, those soup items. What do you need to do in terms of, because most of these items are going to be from AWS or Microsoft or some of those platforms, which are you're not going to get a supplier audit, for example, done. You're going to have to look at some certification that gives you the quality assurance that you need to have in mind to make sure that the code that you're going to build on top of that will be done with confidence.
Yeah.
And that's where we're going with it, because in production terms, when you look at hardware, that's what you're doing, the same thing. You're manufacturing your own medical device in a production space which has already had validated equipment. The infrastructure has been validated. The shop floor and the space, the clean room and the environment that's being manufactured, all of those physical specifics would be validated, right? And that's the way ISO 13485, it's written almost as if you're thinking about that the hardware, the physical medical devices. Now we have to apply that, and we have to be a bit creative of how we're going to apply those same clauses into that medical device software. And this is how we're applying it, because we have to think about the medical device software which is being written, the software code, the processes. And so we also have to write protocols. We have to write a master validation plan. Um, and more recently, FDA, for example, has come out with the CAC, the Computer Software Assurance guidance, which replaces the old GHTF process validation guidance document. And actually, just earlier on this week, I was looking at that just in line with this discussion, is how does that complement things? Because in the past, I mean, I've had situations where we've done validation in companies that I've worked, and we've validated for software, and we've used GAMP. So some people will be familiar with GAMP. Now, GAMP originally came from the pharmaceutical industry and then worked its way into the medical device industry, and was really looking at software systems, computer software systems, and you've also then got to apply 21 CFR Part 11 for electronic records and signature. So that framework that exists really tries to underlie an impact assessment and a risk assessment that you're applying to the software items that you're about to validate. Now, in the FDA terms, this never really existed. So when I've had an audit done in the past from FDA auditors, they're saying don't use GAMP, use FDA guidance document if it's being sold in the US specifically. If you've got FDA 510K or five submissions in the US, then you should be using guidance documents from the FDA. Now, I think this new document that's come out in September bridges that gap, and because it then produces some of that impact assessment. In essence, when I looked over it, it was looking at high risk and low risk software items which you're using for validation of your own software. So if you stay with me, I know this can be a little bit confusing,
Sure.
but if you stay with the conversation, that we're still in the production environment where we're still trying to make sure that we've got confidence in that virtual space where we're then writing this software code within this work environment, which we're building these building blocks. So we have to make sure that we've got the confidence in all of that. So we're applying the whole system in the framework. We've got automated pipelines. We need to write those protocols. We need to have that validation plan. We need to do a risk assessment. So if we're not validating some of those items, what's the rationale that we're not validating them? It may be because there's nothing that you can validate. You might be doing some verification. It might be because the software itself is an iterative process in itself. We don't use a waterfall diagram, which with a lot of software. And again, if you look at ISO 13485, clause 7.3, when it goes into the whole design and development, it's also very much focused on a waterfall approach. And when we apply that to medical device software, we're really looking at an agile process where it's iterative. So there's also standards for that, guidance documents like AAMI, TIR 45 for looking at agile processes. So we have to apply a lot of ISO 13485 in those terms into medical device software. So even things like clauses like 7.5.8, when we're looking at identification and traceability, right? So in hardware, that's quite easy to apply because that's the mindset that many of us have come from. But then when you come into software code, you've then got to look at the identification and traceability of the software to the user requirements. You've got to look at design specifications. Software requirement specifications is a specific requirement from EN 62304. And EN 62304 is, for those people that aren't familiar with that, that is the medical device software standard that you have to follow. You have to look at the class safety classifications, class A, B, and C, and look at the risks involved, and then you go through all of those items for validation.
And
So
yeah, it has a really good visual of the V model of system subsystem requirements and so on. Two things real quick. I don't want to interrupt you necessarily, but GAMP, because some people might not be familiar with that acronym, Good Automated Manufacturing Process. I think the latest is GAMP 5. That's all I've ever heard as far as
yeah,
it's been, if it is the latest, it's been the latest for a while. But anyway,
it
GAMP
has.
5. And then
Yeah.
the other thing I'll mention, I was just wanted to, before we get too far down the road, when we look at 7.5 production and service provisions in ISO 3045, are all of them applicable? And maybe we can talk through some that maybe aren't applicable, if any. But I don't want to slow you down too, if you had another point to make there.
No, I mean we can have a look at that. I mean, what I also like to do is when you look at definitely, I mean, there's lots of the clauses in 13485 within clause 7.5 that won't be applicable. Anything to do with
Yeah.
standardization, for example, right? So
Cleanliness of product. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so those are kind of pretty obvious ones, unless you're looking at software in the medical device. So you could actually have an active implantable which has to be sterile. So it's not the software part that you're applying, but it's the physical part again, which is
Yeah.
sterile. Which then clause 7.5, point 5, for example, particular requirements for sterile medical devices, and 7.5.7 might come into play for sterilization of sterile barriers. So those would typically be non-applications
Yeah.
for non-applicable clauses for medical device software because there's nothing there to sterilize. Now, the other thing you've also got is installation can come into effect because you might physically install software.
What
Even the
about
cloud
you? Go ahead.
systems, cloud systems, we also have to make sure that the cloud systems are also have a validated environment.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, for example, Greenlight Guru or Ultralight, whichever one you were to use from our EQMS platform. There's an installation qualification that we expect you to go through, and it's a cloud-based platform. So yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so one of the things that we also want to be clear of is not to confuse EQMS
Yeah,
validation with medical device, right? So the software as a medical device,
I'm
that's
glad
the
I'm glad you caught that. That's a good point. As soon as the words came out of my mouth, like, well, that's muddying the water.
yeah, no, but I'm going to come on to that as well because when I was thinking about this, I'm also thinking about clause 4.1.6, and
Okay.
that's the software validation. So what you're talking about here is more clause 4.1.6, where an
Yep.
EQMS has to have validation, so the IQ needs to be validated. But I'm glad you brought that up because even the soup items that we were talking about earlier on, they can be considered to be part of clause 4.1.6, where you have to make sure that you've established that master validation plan. So it's clause 7.5.6, where we talked about the validation of the process, but it also can be impacted from clause 4.1.6 because we also have to have a look at, for example, the intended use of the soup items. We have to look at the validation activities, revalidation, and we have to look at risk assessment. So 4.1.6 does actually come into effect for that. But then the other clauses which are also interesting, clause 4.2.3, medical device requirements. Right. So
Okay.
what do you do here for medical device file requirements? Right. So we're typically ISO 13485 will list out, I can't remember if it's A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It lists out the contents of the medical device file. It will say things like labeling, instructions, specifications, and all these type of things, and um, bill of materials, right? So what do you do then? So in medical device terms, we've also got to think about an e-label, for instance. So very often you'll have an e-label. Sometimes if you go down to the drop-down menu, you might have a About Us section in the headers, and the About Us very often has a version of the software. In that version, the versioning control that's considered to be part of your e-label. And now you can also have components like UDI for unique device identification. Your number can also be in that e-label. So that's also part of 4.2.3. So we're looking at labeling and e-labeling, right? So not just physical, but also the e-label part of the software. Then what's really interesting is also things like system architecture. your specification. So the SRS, which will be your software requirement specification, will also come under the contents of the medical device file, clause 4.2.3, data requirements, cybersecurity controls, and the SBoM, which is really interesting because that's another topic. So, what is the software bill of materials, the components, the dependencies, the libraries, and you have to have the version controls and change history documented for all of that SBOM. There's some really interesting articles. I mean, people can Google that on the SBOM, what an SBOM should look like for medical device software. We don't have enough time to look at it now, but there are some good guidance documents like I mentioned, the FDA have got some good guidance documents. There are AMI guidance documents. And there's also, more recently, I've been looking at, I think it's 34971, which looks at how to apply ISO 14971 risk management in AI and machine learning. So recently, I've also been having a look at that as well. And then the cybersecurity controls, there's a whole list of cybersecurity standards out there, which you also have to apply. Now, the responsibility of identifying those standards and guidelines lies with the manufacturer. As the legal manufacturer, you've got to make sure that you have the state of the art identified standards and you're applying them to your device and technology. Because even with medical device software, there's so many different applications. They could be installed, it might not be installed, it could be cloud, it may be running from a physical machine which is installed in a laboratory or a hospital or a clinic. And it might be just running off cloud, it might be a software as a service. SWAS, as we call it. And so the cybersecurity controls, we have to look at interoperability. You've got to look at the threats. I'm not a cybersecurity expert by any means at all, but there's cybersecurity experts there. If you look at the FDA guidance, there's a list of nearly 15 documents that you've got to produce for cybersecurity alone, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and even within that, there's risk analysis. So we do risk analysis according to ISO 14971, which is actually for the device as a whole. We will look at you look at the design and you look at more of the usability because there's no real process risks. You look at really design risks and you look at the usability risks for medical device software. The cybersecurity, because it's got almost a mind of its own, you've really got to look at the whole package of what's required. Now, all of this that we're talking about comes under clause 4.2.3 as part of your medical device file requirements. So that's looking at clause 4.2.3. As I said in the beginning of this podcast, I'm cherry picking
Sure.
some of those clauses which will apply, and some of the ones that will not apply that we said, quite clearly that is for hardware only, and those sterile ones, for example, won't. Um,
Well, quick question. So if we talk about the production side, I'm curious for software that updates maybe continuously, what actually counts as production under ISO 1345? What would you say?
so there is because software has an iterative process. What you need to have a look at is any bugs and patches that need to be fixed, that basically need to be ironed out. That might have there may be some glitches. There might be revision history that's coming out, new versions that are coming out, and you've also got to then look at the change history. So the design, if there's a specific design change, which is changing the design. So I get asked this question a lot. So in
Yeah.
the end, I had to actually produce a separate guidance document for what's considered significant change within the actual device software itself, and what's not considered a change that you can bypass. You don't have to have a look at it from the ISO standard or the regulatory standards that this is considered to be a significant change. From the production, you've then got to have a look at from the production clauses, you've got to see if there's any changes that you made with this, because I call them building blocks, the soup items which I refer to. And if there's anything that you changed within that, because I had a situation recently where 6 to 12 months elapsed where the last time the software validation was actually done for those soup items. And then what happened was we realized that during development, the software development team ended up using these other items which were not validated. So we have to then revise that software validation plan and then make sure that we've got impact assessments for those items. Again, revise it, look at the impact assessment, look at risk assessment, and consider validating those items if they've never been validated. Because effectively what you've done is you've introduced elements within the quote unquote production space which have not been validated. So that's the thing you've got to be really conscious of.
Yeah.
And that's what I would say which should be the role of quality and compliance or the QA function. There should be someone that has that role and responsibility has got to make sure that they're on top of that with software developers. And that can be quite tricky sometimes because software developers will just run 1,000 miles an hour, and they'll again it's just like in real production because product in manufacturing, very, very well as much as I do. QA have to catch up. And it's the
Yeah.
same thing with medical device software.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, mechanical engineer with access to SolidWorks would probably and a 3D printer would probably be iterating every day as well. So yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah.
so and you mentioned agile development a little bit. I'm curious if you feel like agile development and ISO 1345 clash, what kind of and if that's to happen, if that does happen, what kind of invisible compromises are happening, or how do you recommend companies approach this?
Yeah, so I actually sat in an ISO 13485 audit once for medical device software, and one of the subject matter experts asked us the question, have you done a risk assessment for all of the versions, the version controls? So while you're developing the device, um, and if you use systems like GitHub, then GitHub should have in it version control
Yeah,
and the opportunity to do risk assessments as well. What's the risk for the new revision that's come out? And the thing that's often missing is how it's been documented. Very often it happens, but very often it's not documented. So how do you document that? That's the key thing you've got to look at is that's from an ISO perspective. That's an open area where there's a possibility for a non-conformance.
yeah. What other parts of the clauses did you want to cherry pick? What other aspects you want to talk about?
Yeah, there's still more. There's still
Oh
more.
yeah. Oh
So
yeah.
clause 6, for example, resource management. And
Okay.
we've got infrastructure requirements. So 6.3. So we're also looking at computing environments. We're looking at data systems. We're looking at security safeguards. Do we have reliable resources, testing environments, the production hosting platforms? That's what we're really been discussing up until now. Um, Disaster recovery capabilities. We've got to look at that as well. So that's the infrastructure part of it. So we look at clause 6.3. We've got to look at also compliant data storage and management systems, backup procedures, version control, access logging, encryption to protect the sensitive healthcare information, right? So we've got to, another area which is often not really understood. Clause 6.4, work environment and contamination control. Uh, this,
Yeah.
this this is a bit out there, right? So I'm going to stretch the imagination a little bit because the work environment, as I've already mentioned, we've been talking about the testing environment, production hosting platforms, but we've also got to look at for example, the workstations. If you've got workstations that you're working on, are they safe? If you've got robust data protection, you've got to have that encryption and access controls for your workstations as well. Looking at teams of engineers that might be working on these environments, data scientists, clinical experts. Do you have the necessary access controls for them? That's all part of 6.4.1. And then when it gets to 6.4.2, this is where you have to push the imagination a little bit further because that's contamination control. So what's contamination control got to do with medical device software? So you've got to look at data corruption. You've got to look at unauthorized code. You've got to look at version controlling malware or ransomware. You've got to look at
Yeah.
that as well. That's all part of that. and this is where cybersecurity and those controls come in. And as I said, that's not my field of expertise, but you've got to make sure that you've got on board someone that understands how to apply this. But that's where clause 6.4.2, for example, will come in.
Yeah.
Um, then I'm going to move on to 7.3.8, design transfer to production.
Mm.
So then again, we're looking at you've done everything in a test environment. Now you're moving into production because an auditor for ISO 13485, especially when you get to stage two, you've got to have records and you've got to be able to demonstrate that you went from the test environment to production. And then how do you then verify or validate that? Because you've also got to then make sure that you have examples of software release. So software release is when you get into like your final release of production. And this is where the software bill of materials comes in really handy. So that going back to clause 4.2.3, where we talked about that medical device file, if you've got like a software bill of materials, that's in essence, that's a bit like saying we've done everything now in the design stages. We're ready to pass this over to production, and this is what a package looks like.
Yeah.
In that package, you've got to have your design outputs, validated code, train models, data pipelines, configuration and documentation. From those development stages into the testing phases, you've got to have the evidence of transferring verification. So all of the elements that you validated. So the software requirement specification that we talked about, those software unit, when we looked at the individual requirements, they've all been validated. And then you would also have the software design trace matrix, right? So the software design trace matrix is just like your design trace matrix, which you would have to trace through your user requirement specifications, your design inputs, your outputs, and then verifying and validating that. In software terms, we've got the same thing because EN 62304, I mean, I've got a bundle of about 16 documents which conform to the requirements to 62304. So as long as you've completed all of them, you've completed the requirements to 62304, the requirements of medical device software. So you've got to make sure that you've got all of those elements ready for production readiness.
16 documents.
Yep, 16 documents.
Yeah,
In 16, those 16 documents, I know some companies do actually bundle them together so there are fewer documents,
sure.
but I've tried and tested this. It's been successful to have those individual documents, and some of those are the risk analysis. You've got the SOUP declaration, you've got software design trace matrix, you've got to do software systems testing. So these are all requirements that 62304 suggests that you have those requirements met. So through a tried and tested model, we've produced those 16 documents that then meet the requirements to 62304.
That's awesome. It makes sense to have standalone documents for things that are going to stand on their own. Um, I'm curious if there are things or in the production clauses if those apply when users influence the outcomes, meaning the user is going to use it in such a way that it's going to change what the software does. Any thoughts about that? And are there any kind of gray areas when it comes to those production controls? Because in my mind, I almost think like, well, that is the production environment almost when it's in the user hands to a certain degree when they're manipulating outcomes. But any thoughts there?
Yeah, so very often what happens is I've also worked in situations where software developers might actually bring up a pop-up, which could be a disclaimer, right? So the
Okay.
disclaimer that comes up informs the user that if you use this software, which is customizable beyond its intended purpose, then we're not taking any responsibility for that. So this is where it gets into the foreseeable misuse. So if you
Yeah.
think about risk, you think about risk management, when it gets to foreseeable misuse, if you've got like a customizable user interface with software, that's where that disclaimer comes in handy. And as I've had this situation with software systems where it's been used for like an online clinical service where sorry, the terms completely escape from my
No.
mind. But if you've got a self-diagnosis, right? So people go onto these systems which Here in the UK, we've got the NHS, National Health Service provides these systems where you can just go in and essentially self-diagnose, right? So if it comes with a diagnosis which um, is not truly what you have,
Yeah.
that's going to lead to some serious implications. But
Yeah.
that disclaimer then at that point is basically comes from the intended use. So what the intended purpose is, if it's used beyond that, then that's where that kind of lies with misuse.
That makes sense. Um, do you feel so? I feel like a lot of software companies look at these clauses and they say, they don't really apply to me. You've kind of explained how they do. And then one of the arguments is, well, we're a software company, we're different, and this is going to slow us down. How do you answer that question?
So I've seen in many situations, I've seen non-applications to a lot of these clauses and sub-clauses. But I would argue that, especially as we're starting to understand software more in the space of artificial intelligence and now machine learning, these things are becoming much more challenging, and even auditors are starting to become more experienced with the field, and they're asking more questions. So they're asking for more evidence. How can something be non-applicable where there still is a possibility, and you have to prove, it's guilty until proven innocent. So it's the theory that you've got to be able to make sure that you can evidence that it is indeed not a non-application. Some of those ones are quite obvious, but other ones, like I mentioned, installation isn't. I mean, servicing on the other hand, because installation and service often
Yeah.
go together, you often find that those who put a non-application with installation very often don't have anything to service either. So while we've already discussed that it's possible to install software, but is it possible to service software? So there's also an argument that you can also, if there's bug fixes and security patches,
Mm.
that could be considered to be servicing.
Yeah,
Uh,
that makes sense. Yeah.
Typically, that would be, again, as I've said, many of the clients that I've worked with, we've chosen to put a non-application, again, 7.5.4. But I think as we're starting to get smarter with medical device software, I think this is going to, some of these other clauses which we previously omitted might start coming into effect, and more auditors may start challenging the.
There's a couple that I can think of. I can use my imagination, as you were saying. I don't know if you mentioned customer property 7.5.10 or preservation of product 7.5.11, or if there are others you want to cover. Any commentary there?
Yeah, I didn't get to it yet. I was going to get to
Okay,
7.5.
I'm getting ahead of myself. Yeah, go ahead.
You are indeed, not because I understand we're short on time, but
No, no.
7.5.10, again, customer property, that's patient data. You've got confidential information.
Yeah.
Um, in some cases, I've had some software where data has been anonymized, so you don't actually have the patient data. So if it's anonymized, there's an argument that you don't have customer property. But if it's not anonymized and it's clear that you're using patient data, then that's clearly confidential information. You've then got to apply HIPAA and GDPR, for example, for contractual confidential information. So
Right.
then cybersecurity elements will definitely come into customer property 7.5.10. 7.5.11, preservation of product, is also another interesting one because you've also then got to demonstrate that you've got preservation again so of the data. If customer property is effective, then preservation of product most likely will also be effective. So you've got to demonstrate that you've got protective measures that you're preserving that data. So that's where that comes into effect. The other one, which is interesting, is clause 8.2 when you get into monitoring and measurement, because post-market surveillance also comes into this, right? So um, I'm going back to EN 62304 requires problem reporting and problem resolution. It's one of the things that's required that if you've got, and that's where continuous improvement and feedback comes in. So where ISO 13485 talks about feedback and complaints, for medical device software, you've got problem reporting and problem resolution is basically the equivalent of feedback and complaints. But you've then got to have a very specific requirements. So the package of documents that I mentioned, where there's 16 documents, one of them would be problem resolution and problem reporting. So in your complaints database, however you manage to do that, you've got to have behavior patterns of performance monitoring for problem resolution and complaints and feedback. You've got to have some method that you're taking feedback in a proactive way. So you've got to make sure that that comes into effect. So 8.2, think about monitoring and measurement, post-market surveillance and monitoring. Then also another one which might be slightly unusual is control of non-conforming product,
Right.
right? So we've also got to have looking at how it's possible to apply. Um, you've got to have some level of protocol which you're looking at defective code, right? You might have invalid data, you might have security patches that you've got to look at and justify deviations, correction of defects. How do you deal with all of that? That is where you've got control of non-conforming product, and then rework. I mean, again, that's another one that's usually omitted. Very often, medical device software will not have rework, post-delivery control. So those are the main ones. So the key takeaways that I would kind of sum up with is make sure that you're looking at ISO 13485 holistically and don't dismiss some of the clauses lightly because there's more and more scrutiny that's coming forward with the auditors understanding AI and machine learning, and there's a hell of a lot more guidance documents that are coming out, both from the FDA and here in Europe, also to understand the challenges that medical device software is presenting. There's more risk-averse solutions, and this is why the recent computer software guidance document that came out.
Okay, so we covered a lot of ground talking about ISO 1345, all the different clauses as they apply to what seems like hardware, but how they actually also apply to software as a medical device. If you could give one piece of advice, or if you could speak to those software as a medical device companies as they're approaching or thinking about these different clauses, what's the advice you would give them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Etienne. So very often, as a quality regulatory consultant, I understand the regulations very well. I'm not a software developer, so very often I have to work in partnership as a team with software developers so that they can understand and so I can guide them through the regulations and what the ISO standards mean so that we can work through this together. Because very often I'm trying to understand the application of the medical device software. I mean, typically I've worked a lot in the mental health care space, cardiovascular, diabetes software. It's a growing sector. There's masses of challenges, and the software code can be really, really complex. It's very important to get the right team members on board at an early stage to make sure that you've got people that understand the regulations, understand the ISO standards, how to apply with the team members, because very often when I'm working with startups, it's usually software developers that are engineers, they understand code, they're experts in code, and they've got no clue about the regulations and the expectations from the medical device world. And as you and I know, that's a very heavily regulated world that we're in with medical device. And we've always got to think about patient safety, think about risk management, thinking about patient risk. And those are the things that we're always thinking about. So when ISO 13485 is onboarded, just like any medical device, try to embrace it as early as possible because it only starts to get more complicated further down the line. And medical device software is no different. As I said, you've got to make sure you've got the right team members and you've got the right mix of skills to make sure things work smoothly.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, especially, each one of those different people, like you said, having those team members, they're going to look at it through a different lens. And that way they can just focus solely on the regulatory, focus solely on the product development, and then have that conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, so it is very much about teamwork. So yeah, it's an interesting space, and as more guidelines and regulations unfold, I'm sure we'll start to get more involved in this more and more.
Yeah. always changing, and I think we're seeing a lot more of this. So great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Adnan. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise on this. Those you've been listening, really appreciate you hanging in there with us, and we will see you all next time, everybody. Take care.